A heartless mother leaves her young daughter to die in the harsh desert. In her despair, the little girl finds a lone, twisted tree. What she finds buried beneath the roots will change her life forever. Nancy sat by the cracked window, watching the fading light stretch across the alley outside. The house, once a bright and lively space, had decayed over time. The walls were thin, cold to the touch, and the floors creaked under the weight of neglect. She'd grown used to the peeling paint, the broken hinges, the emptiness echoing in every room. It was her world now, the only one she had known. Her mother, Phoebe, hadn't been home for days. When she was, the interactions between them were cold, calculated, like two strangers bound by circumstance. Nancy had learned early on how to fend for herself, preparing simple meals, washing her own clothes, and making sure the house stayed in some semblance of order. There was no telling when Phoebe would come home. It could be midnight or it could be early morning, her steps heavy and unsteady as she fumbled for the keys. She would smell like the clubs, like sweat, smoke, and 100 other people's forgotten conversations. And she wouldn't notice Nancy, not really. She never did. Phoebe's eyes would be glazed over, distracted, as though Nancy were just another fixture in the room, like the old chair with the broken leg or the coat that never moved from its spot. Nancy placed the cup back down on the table and looked at the chair again, at the coat that symbolized so much of her mother. How long had it been like this? How many nights had she sat here, waiting for a woman who no longer remembered how to care? The years blurred together in her memory, a haze of broken promises and quiet disappointments. Phoebe was always late, always somewhere else, lost in her own world while Nancy stayed behind, invisible in the shadows. She leaned back in her chair, feeling the weight of exhaustion settle into her bones. It wasn't just the physical tiredness that weighed on her, but something deeper, a kind of weariness that came from wanting things to be different and knowing they never would be. The tea had cooled by the time she took another sip, the warmth gone. Outside, the sound of a car door slamming caught her attention. Nancy sat up, her heart quickening for a moment, but when the footsteps didn't follow, she relaxed back into her seat. It was just another night waiting for someone who would never truly arrive. The minutes ticked by, each one a reminder that nothing would change tonight. And yet, a part of her still clung to the hope, the foolish, stubborn hope that one day Phoebe would come home early. That one day she would walk through the door and see Nancy sitting there, waiting, and something in her would change. Something in her would remember what it meant to be a mother. But Nancy knew better. She had long since stopped counting on it. Instead, she stayed in the quiet, boiling water for tea and staring at the coat that still smelled like cigarettes and perfume, the only real trace Phoebe ever left behind. The flickering flame seemed fragile, like everything in her life. She wandered into the hallway, the sound of Phoebe's voice catching her off guard. Nancy froze, realizing her mother had returned. She pressed herself against the wall, listening. Yes, I regret it. Having her was the biggest mistake I ever made. Phoebe's voice was sharp, cold. I should have done something sooner. The words hit Nancy like a blow to the chest. She had always known her mother didn't care, but to hear it said out loud, the truth tore through her, leaving a hollowness that threatened to swallow her whole. She pressed her hand against her mouth to stifle the sob rising in her throat. She couldn't let Phoebe hear her. Not now. Phoebe hung up the phone abruptly, her footsteps approaching the door. Nancy quickly retreated to her room, barely making it in time before the door swung open. Phoebe's silhouette stood in the doorway, a suitcase by her side, her expression hardened by years of dissatisfaction and bitterness. "Get up," she ordered. "We're leaving." Nancy stared at her mother, confused. Where are we going? Don't ask questions, Phoebe snapped, yanking clothes from the closet and shoving them into a bag. We don't have time. Panic rose in Nancy's chest. She scrambled to her feet, her small hands fumbling as she tried to gather a few things from the dresser. Phoebe's abrupt decision felt like a looming storm, and though she didn't understand the full gravity of what was happening, the fear in her chest grew with every hasty movement her mother made. "Mom, please, what's going on?" Nancy's voice trembled, but Phoebe ignored her. She was too consumed with her own thoughts, her own need to escape whatever life she was trapped in. Phoebe paused for a moment, looking at her daughter with an expression that could only be described as distant. "We'll be gone for a while. Just pack and don't make this harder than it needs to be." Nancy nodded, her heart pounding. She felt the weight of the unknown hanging over her, suffocating her. The certainty that something terrible was waiting for them, waiting for her, pressed heavily in the air. With her small bag clutched in her hands, Nancy followed her mother out of the house. The night was cold, a sharp contrast to the warmth of the stove that had barely filled their tiny kitchen. In that moment, Nancy realized she was truly alone, and the only person who could save her from this life was herself. But even as the night swallowed them, Nancy couldn't shake the dread that something far worse was yet to come. Upon hearing those words, Nancy felt her world crumbling around her. Her own mother was determined to leave her behind, as if she were nothing more than an old, discarded suitcase. "What will you do with the girl?" the driver asked, breaking the thick silence. In front of the door, an old and disheveled taxi. He waited with the engine on, and inside, a man who Nancy had never seen watched them to the moment, taking her through unknown streets, wrapped in a silence that for Nancy was heavier than any word. Phoebe shrugged with complete indifference. "I'll figure something out. All I know is I'm not taking her with me. It's best she stays where no one knows her." The taxi kept moving forward, and with every passing mile, Nancy felt smaller, lonelier, more lost. During the trip, Nancy could not help but listen to the conversation that her mother kept with the driver, a talk that would reveal truths more crude than any girl could bear. Pretending to watch the city's flashing lights through the window, he used his ear and listened to each fragment of what they said. "I can't go on with this life anymore," said Phoebe, her voice full of asthma. Nancy squeezed her lips, knowing they were talking about her, but begging that it was not true. "I'm going to start again, with him," the driver insisted, keeping an eye on the road, while Phoebe kept speaking each harder word than the previous one. "He doesn't know anything about my daughter," Phoebe continued without any remorse. "I don't want him to know. It would be the end for me. I don't need her. She only bothers me." Phoebe paused for a moment, looking at her daughter with an expression that could only be described as distant. Outside, the city lights were slowly fading, much like her hope inside. Yet, deep within her, a tiny flicker of determination began to stir. If her mother didn't love her, if she was willing to abandon her, then Nancy knew she would have to be strong. Phoebe might leave her behind, but she would not abandon herself. The taxi rolled down a deserted road, the landscape around them turning more desolate with every passing minute. Nancy's anxiety grew, but she was too afraid to ask where they were going. She feared that if she spoke, something even worse would happen. And she wasn't wrong. When the taxi finally came to a stop, Nancy peered out the window, and what she saw chilled her to the bone. There was nothing around, just a barren, endless stretch of desert that seemed to go on forever. The wind blew gently, stirring up small clouds of sand that danced and vanished in the air. The sky was dark, and the only light came from the headlights of the taxi, illuminating a small patch of earth before them. It was as though they had arrived in the middle of nowhere. Before Nancy could process what was happening, Phoebe stepped out of the car, popped open the trunk, and tossed her daughter's suitcase onto the ground, sending up a puff of dust. Nancy was frozen, her voice barely a whisper, trembling with fear. What are we doing here?" she managed to ask. Phoebe stepped closer, and for the first time, Nancy saw something terrifying in her mother's eyes. Coldness, an icy indifference that made her take a step back. With a tone as sharp as a blade, Phoebe said, "From now on, you're on your own. Don't look for me again, and don't try to come back." Nancy felt the earth collapse beneath her feet. Alone? Here? Her mother's words echoed in her mind, but she couldn't fully grasp them. This had to be a cruel joke, some horrible nightmare she would wake from any minute. She grabbed Phoebe's arm, pleading, her voice desperate. "Please, don't leave me here. I can't be alone. I promise I'll be good. I won't be any trouble." But Phoebe pulled away, shaking off her daughter's grip as though the touch disgusted her. "Enough, Nancy," she snapped, her voice ringing out against the vast emptiness of the desert. "You're a burden, and I don't want anything to do with you anymore. Just disappear." Nancy collapsed to her knees, the pain in her chest unbearable. Tears streamed uncontrollably down her face, mixing with the cold desert wind that stung her skin. Her sobs came in broken gasps as she whispered, "Please don't leave me here. I promise I won't be any trouble." But Phoebe wasn't listening anymore. She gave her daughter one last glance before turning her back and heading toward the taxi. Nancy tried to stand, her legs trembling as she staggered a few steps after her mother. But she couldn't go on. The terror paralyzed her, rooting her to the ground as she watched the taxi pull away, the headlights shrinking into the distance, until there was nothing left but darkness. The vast desert swallowed her cries, leaving her alone in the cold, silent night. Nancy stood helpless as she watched the taxi disappear down the road, taking away the only person she had in the world, the one person who should have protected her. Now she was stranded, left alone in a desolate place. The weight of abandonment pressed down on her fragile body, and she crumbled to the ground, shaking with despair. The wind picked up, whipping the dust into the air and covering her small suitcase with a fine layer of dirt. The emptiness of the desert around her was overwhelming, and the silence was suffocating. "Mama," she whispered one final time, her voice barely audible as the wind carried her words away into the void. Clutching her suitcase tightly, Nancy felt the cold creeping in, seeping through her thin clothes. Above her, the stars blinked in the vast, endless sky, distant and indifferent, just like her hope. She was utterly alone, abandoned in the middle of nowhere. Tears streamed down her face. But amidst the sorrow, a quiet resolve began to form. If her mother had left her here, if she had been abandoned in this hostile place, Nancy would survive. She wouldn't let the darkness take her. In the distance, she spotted the silhouette of a lone tree, standing like a forgotten sentinel in the barren landscape. "If I can make it to that tree, I can rest," she told herself, clinging to the small shred of hope she had left. Each step was a struggle, her feet sinking into the dry, sandy earth. With what little strength remained, she reached the tree and collapsed beneath it, her body shaking uncontrollably, not just from the cold, but from the fear that gnawed at her insides. The tree, though withering, had a few green leaves hanging on. Nancy's stomach growled loudly, and despite the bitter taste, she picked a few leaves and chewed them slowly. The taste was unpleasant, but she had no other choice. "At least this will give me a little strength," she whispered to herself, her voice shaky, as if speaking aloud might quell the terror rising within her. The wind howled, cutting through her like a knife, and she knew she wouldn't make it through the night, without finding shelter. She remembered watching nature shows on TV where animals would dig into the ground to escape the extremes of heat and cold. If they can do it, so can I, she thought, determined to survive. With raw, aching hands, she began to dig. Her fingers clawed at the soft dirt, slowly carving out a small hollow in the ground. Once the hole was big enough, she crawled inside, letting the sand cover her as a shield from the biting wind. The cold was still sharp, but the sand provided some protection. "This is better. Better than freezing," she murmured, curling up in her makeshift shelter. As she shifted to get comfortable, her fingers brushed against something hard beneath the sand. She paused, her curiosity momentarily pushing aside the fatigue. "What is this?" she whispered, more to herself than to anyone. With trembling fingers, she continued digging, the sand easily giving way. Soon she unearthed a rusted metal chest, coated in dust but unmistakably buried on purpose. Her heart raced. How had a chest ended up here, in the middle of this vast desert? She didn't know, but something inside her urged her to open it. "Will it be a treasure?" Nancy whispered to herself, her voice barely audible in the still night. Her wide eyes shimmered in the soft glow of the moon as her fingers continued to dig furiously through the dirt. Finally, with a surge of effort, she managed to pry open the chest's lid. The rusty hinges squealed, disturbing the quiet desert air, and when Nancy peeked inside, her heart nearly stopped. There, nestled in the old chest, were piles of gold coins, glittering jewels, and small bars of precious metal. It was real. An actual treasure, the kind she had only ever dreamed about in stories. "This can't be happening," she whispered, her hand flying to her mouth as though someone might overhear and steal her find. For a few moments she just stared at the chest's contents, her mind racing faster than it had ever done before. She knew there was no way she could take it all with her, but just the thought of leaving it behind filled her with both fear and determination. "I'll come back for you," she muttered under her breath, as if making a solemn vow. She slung her backpack over her shoulder, and despite the biting cold of the desert night, she sat beneath a nearby tree, wrapping her arms around herself for warmth. The desert stretched endlessly around her, vast and intimidating. But Nancy wasn't scared anymore. She had found something worth fighting for. A flicker of hope stirred in her chest. This treasure wasn't just wealth. It was a chance, a new beginning. And while the wind howled and the cold gnawed at her bones, she allowed herself the smallest of smiles. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give her strength. She would return. No matter how hard the world tried to beat her down, Nancy swore she would find a way. By morning, exhausted but determined, she found the first store she could in the small desert town. Nancy's face was smeared with dust. Her clothes, clinging to her in tattered rags, stood at the edge of the small town, her heart pounding as she clutched the few pieces of gold she had taken from the chest. It was enough to get by for now, enough to buy her first meal in days and find shelter for the night. But she knew that this was just the beginning. Walking through the quiet streets, she felt the stares of the locals, their curious eyes following her every move. She was a stranger in this place, a young girl who didn't belong, yet here she was, determined to carve out a future. The town was modest, with old wooden buildings lining the main road and a general store at the center where people came and went. At the inn, she placed the gold on the counter, her hand trembling slightly as she asked for a room and a simple meal. The innkeeper, a gruff man with a weathered face, glanced down at the gold, then up at Nancy. He hesitated for a moment, as if unsure whether a girl like her should have such valuable coins, but eventually nodded and handed her a key. Later, in the small room, Nancy sat on the bed, her body weary, but her mind racing. The weight of everything that had happened in the past few days pressed down on her. She had survived the desert, she had found gold, and now she had a roof over her head. But she couldn't stop here. Survival wasn't enough. She wanted more. The next morning, Nancy made a decision. She needed an education, needed to understand how to manage what little wealth she had and how to grow it. She could feel the potential of the gold burning in her pocket, but it would do her no good if she didn't know how to use it. She would go to school. Walking through the town, she asked around until she found a small, worn-down schoolhouse at the edge of town. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Inside, a teacher, a kind but stern woman in her 50s, looked surprised when Nancy asked to enroll. Most of the children here were from local farming families, and they came to school as much for the community as for learning. But Nancy's determination was undeniable. "I want to learn about business, about money, how to make more of it," Nancy said, her voice steady. The teacher raised an eyebrow, but didn't dismiss her. "We don't usually teach that here," she replied, her tone curious. "But you're welcome to learn what we can offer." And so Nancy began her lessons, throwing herself into reading, math, and anything else that might give her a foothold in the world she had found herself in. The days were long, but she didn't mind. Every new fact, every piece of knowledge she gained felt like another step forward. As weeks turned into months, the people of the town started to take notice. They saw the girl who had arrived with nothing, yet carried herself with an unusual focus and determination. Nancy wasn't like the other children in the town. She didn't laugh or play much, and she often stayed behind after school, talking to the teacher about topics far beyond the usual lessons. She asked about investments, about saving money, about the power of owning land or starting a business. These were ideas foreign to most of the locals, but Nancy was undeterred. Every night in her rented room, she sketched out plans for the future, drawing on the limited wealth she had from the chest and dreaming of ways to multiply it. The townspeople whispered about her, a quiet girl who seemed far too wise for her age. Some were suspicious, while others admired her drive, but Nancy didn't care what they thought. She knew what she had to do, and she was prepared to see it through. Little by little, she was building something, not just from the gold in her pocket, but from the knowledge she was gathering. And as she looked out over the town from her small window at night, she knew this was only the first step. She wasn't just going to survive, she was going to succeed. "I'll come back for the rest of the treasure," she promised herself every night, gazing up at the stars from her window. "And when I do, I'll know exactly what to do with it." Weeks turned into months, but Nancy never stopped learning, never stopped fighting for the future she envisioned. She understood that the knowledge she was acquiring was her most valuable asset, far more precious than any chest of gold. Years passed, and Nancy, once the scared little girl abandoned in the desert, had grown into a strong and determined woman. The world had tried to break her, but she had learned how to survive, how to thrive. She had long promised herself that she would return for the treasure she had buried under the desert sands. And now, as an adult, legally empowered and wise from years of study, she knew the time had come. On a blazing, sun-drenched afternoon, Nancy returned to the desert. This time, she wasn't afraid. Her footsteps were sure and steady as she followed the familiar path her memories had etched in her mind. She arrived at the place where everything had changed for her, the old tree that had once been her only shelter during that cold, frightening night. "Here you are," she murmured with a smile, gently running her hand over the weathered bark. No tears came this time, only determination. But those memories no longer had power over her. Each scoop of sand brought her closer to closing the chapter that had shaped her life. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, her fingers hit something solid. The old, rusted metal chest was still there, untouched, waiting to be claimed. With a steady hand, Nancy opened the lid, and once again, the gleam of gold met her eyes, like an old friend welcoming her back. But Nancy didn't rush to act. She knew better now. Wealth alone wasn't enough. She had spent years preparing herself, learning everything she could about investments, business, and how to create something meaningful that would transcend the simple value of money. Now she was ready to transform the treasure into something greater, something that would not only change her life, but also leave a lasting impact. Rather than forgetting the desert, she chose it as the site of her grand vision. Where once there had been nothing but desolation and loneliness, Nancy would create an oasis. It wouldn't just be a refuge for weary travelers, but a symbol of her strength, a testament to what a girl, once abandoned, had achieved against all odds. The heat pressed down like a constant reminder of what once was, a barren desert, a place of isolation and forgotten dreams. But Nancy stood at the edge of the construction site, her gaze sweeping across the horizon, determined. The world had cast her aside. Yet, here she was, ready to transform the wasteland into something thriving, something alive. "Are the irrigation systems ready?" Nancy asked, her voice steady, though the weight of the project rested heavily on her shoulders. "Almost, ma'am," replied Javier, the head engineer. He wiped the sweat from his brow. "We'll have the water flowing by the end of the week." Nancy nodded, her mind already shifting to the next phase. The oasis wasn't just about creating a luxury destination. It was a statement. Every palm tree, every pond, every stone path represented a step away from her past and towards her future. She wasn't building for profit. She was building to prove to herself and the world that she could. As she walked along the makeshift paths, she could hear the hum of workers in the distance. The construction of hotels and cabins was well underway, each one designed to blend seamlessly with the environment. They weren't just buildings, they were extensions of the desert, as if the sand had decided to grow roots and form structures. By the following morning, as the tourists arrived, the oasis was far from complete, but it was already drawing attention. Word had spread, and people from all over were curious about the woman who was building an oasis where there had only been dust and despair. The locals, who had once viewed the desert as a place of hardship, now saw it through new eyes. The promise of prosperity and renewal was tangible, and they were beginning to believe in her vision as well. As the visitors marveled at the construction, Nancy stood quietly to the side, watching. The oasis was still in its infancy, but it had already begun to stir something in the hearts of those who saw it. Pride swelled within her, not just for the work itself, but for what it represented. "This is only the beginning," she whispered to herself, the breeze carrying her words across the dunes. She had transformed the desert, and in doing so, had transformed herself. The oasis was her story. A story of resilience, of rebuilding from the ground up, and soon it would stand as a testament to anyone who had ever been told they couldn't. As the sun set, casting a warm glow over the half-built paradise, Nancy knew that this place, her oasis, would be her legacy. The opening day of the oasis tourist area, the warm breeze of the evening rippled through the gathered crowd as Nancy stood at the center of Oasis. The opening of this refuge was supposed to be a symbol of her triumph, a place where the community could find peace. It was meant to represent her victory over the barren, painful desert of her past. Yet, as the soft murmur of voices filled the air, something colder gripped her heart. She saw her, Phoebe, Her mother, once so distant, now limping towards her, dressed in ragged clothes, with the weight of years etched deeply in her face. The crowd parted slowly as Phoebe drew closer, their murmurs of surprise and intrigue growing louder. The cameras from the press turned in unison, capturing every second of the unfolding drama. For years, Nancy had craved this confrontation. The child inside her had longed for a mother's embrace, an apology that could heal the scars Phoebe had left when she abandoned her in the desert without a backward glance. But as she gazed at the woman before her now, Nancy realized something. This wasn't about love or redemption. Nancy stood frozen, her hands clenched into tight fists. She had envisioned this moment in her darkest dreams, but never like this. Not with her mother looking so frail, not with the world watching. Phoebe's voice broke through the tension, her words trembling as she reached out. "Nancy, my child," she pleaded, tears already streaking her face. I've come back to you. I've made mistakes. So many mistakes. Please, please, forgive me." Her words, fragile as they were, hung in the air, waiting for a response. The onlookers were silent, their eyes darting between mother and daughter, eager to witness what would happen next. Phoebe had returned for herself, not for Nancy. The tears, the apologies, the spectacle. It was all for show. Nancy could see it in the desperation behind her mother's eyes. Phoebe didn't come for the daughter she had discarded. She came because she had nothing left. She was homeless, destitute, and clinging to the hope that Nancy's success could be her salvation. The crowd shifted, uncomfortable with the silence. Phoebe reached out again, her voice trembling. "Please, my dear, forgive me. I had no choice." Nancy drew a slow breath, letting the familiar anger, once so raw and painful, settle into calm resolve. She wasn't the helpless little girl her mother left behind. Not any more. She lifted her chin, her voice steady and clear, though not loud. "You had a choice, Phoebe. You always had a choice." Phoebe's hand hovered in the air, her fingers trembling before she let it fall. "Nancy, I didn't know what to do. I didn't have anyone. I was just a child," Nancy interrupted, her tone firm. "You didn't just abandon me. You abandoned your responsibility as a mother. And now, you want to walk back into my life because you've lost everything." Phoebe's face twisted in pain, her sobs growing louder, but Nancy didn't flinch. "I am not that little girl anymore," Nancy said quietly, her words sharp and final. "You don't get to come back when it's convenient for you. I've made a life for myself without you. I've built this oasis. I've found my own family, my own happiness." The sobs subsided, and a chilling realization washed over Phoebe's face. There was no forgiveness here, no grand reunion. This was the end of the road for her. The tears ran dry as the weight of rejection settled on her shoulders. She staggered back, defeated. Without another word, Phoebe turned and shuffled away, disappearing into the crowd. Nancy watched her go, feeling neither joy nor sadness. Only closure. The cameras clicked, capturing the end of a story that began long ago in the harsh desert. Nancy stood tall, not broken but whole, knowing that her future was now fully her own. The years had passed quietly, each one bringing Nancy further from the life she once knew. The harsh desert that had once threatened to swallow her whole was now her sanctuary, a flourishing oasis that thrived under her care. The lush trees and vibrant flowers stood as testament to her resilience, each plant a reminder of her will to survive and build something out of nothing. The early morning sun painted the landscape in soft hues of gold and as Nancy stood on the porch of her home, she felt a deep sense of contentment wash over her. This was her haven now, a place of peace, growth, and love. She glanced over her shoulder as her husband, Daniel, emerged from the house, smiling warmly as their children ran past him, laughing and playing. He gave her a knowing look, one that held both admiration and pride. "You've done something incredible here," he said, his voice steady, free from exaggeration. "Not many people can say they've built their dreams from the ground up." Nancy smiled softly, the memories of her journey flashing briefly in her mind. "It wasn't easy," she replied, her tone calm but firm. "But I've learned that nothing worth having ever is." She turned her gaze back to the oasis, watching the sunlight glisten off the surface of the small lake they had dug together years ago. It had taken time, effort, and more than a few setbacks, but now the oasis was not only a home, but a symbol, a beacon for others seeking hope and solace in the desert. She glanced at her children, their joyful shouts filling the air. It was moments like this that made everything she had gone through worthwhile: the loneliness, the heartbreak, the uncertainty. Standing there, watching her family grow and thrive, she knew she had found the happiness she had once thought was beyond her reach. As the sun rose higher in the sky, Nancy took a deep breath, letting the warm air fill her lungs. She wasn't haunted by her past anymore. She had made peace with it. The desert, once so unforgiving, had become her partner in this journey, shaping her into the woman she was today. With one last look at the oasis, Nancy smiled, the kind of smile that comes from knowing you've weathered the storm and come out stronger on the other side. In her later years, Nancy never regretted her decision to distance herself from her mother. She didn't harbor hate or bitterness, but she had come to understand that not everyone deserved a place in her life. Phoebe had been one of those people. As Nancy lay in her bed during her final days, surrounded by those who truly cared for her, she knew she had made the right choices. She wasn't afraid of dying because she knew her life had been meaningful. She had overcome hardship and heartache and had found a way to carve out happiness for herself. Her success wasn't just in material terms, but in the richness of her heart. And so, as the light of her life slowly faded, her story continued to be told by those who knew it. The story of an abandoned girl who had grown into a strong woman, a tale that reminded everyone of the cost of selfishness and the power of resilience. Meanwhile, Phoebe, the mother who once wished her daughter would disappear, remained lost to the streets, a forgotten shadow, overlooked even by fate itself. The day Nancy had turned her back was still fresh in Phoebe's mind, though years had passed. Phoebe had walked through the crowd that day, each step feeling heavier than the last. The cameras, the whispers, and the stares had all blurred together into a single, crushing weight. Her daughter's cold rejection had been final. There was no space for reconciliation, no room for forgiveness. "You lost that right," Nancy had said, and she was right. Some nights Phoebe would wander the streets, her eyes scanning the lights of bustling cafes and crowded restaurants. She'd peer through the glass windows, watching families gathered around tables, their laughter muffled by the walls between them. In another life, perhaps she could have been one of them, sitting beside Nancy, watching her grandchildren laugh, feeling the warmth of belonging. But those moments were never hers to have. She had forfeited them long ago. In the end, Phoebe had nothing: no wealth, no home, and no family. She was left with only the ghost of her past, a constant reminder of the woman she had failed to be. Her daughter had escaped the cycle of abandonment and pain, while Phoebe remained trapped in the misery she had crafted for herself. The world had moved on, and Phoebe, once dreaming of luxury and love, was left behind, an empty shell of the mother she never was. Wow, what an emotional journey. Nancy's strength in the face of abandonment is a reminder that even when the world turns its back on you, there's always hope if you keep pushing forward. Her story is a powerful testament to resilience and survival, and it shows us that even in our darkest moments, we can find the courage to keep going. If this story touched your heart, be sure to hit that like button, share your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe for more stories that inspire and uplift. Remember, no matter how tough things get, there's always a way forward. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.